This is our scripture reading this morning from Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Good to see everybody here today. I've been wanting to talk about this for a little bit because I know how much grief has been going on with everybody. Obviously, with Ray passing away most recently, and then Ken before that, and Joyce before that, and my wife a few years ago. A lot of people enduring a great deal of grief, as well as a number of our friends and loved ones are in hospice, or in critical kind of health situations, expecting to pass away in the near future. And so I understand that there is a lot of grief, but I also understand it isn't just about the loss of loved ones that they're passing on that causes grief. A lot of the grief that is being endured is for things such as health. There's been a lot of people who just have chronic health problems, and that brings a great deal of grief with it, as does the loss of relationships, friendships, the loss of and I don't just mean them passing away, but the relationship maybe, turns so that it's no longer a friendship, that it's no longer a relationship that you can count on or that builds you up. And so losing those kinds of things cause grief for us, along with our own sin. When we sin, one of the proper responses to sin is actually grief. And the only times we don't really have grief over sin is when our consciences are seared, when they don't work properly. But when our conscience condemns us for having done something wrong, we feel a certain amount of grief. There even when we're young, it's often a kind of a loss of innocence when we realize, that we're no longer, innocent and simple and, just going along when we've done something wrong and terrible. Sometimes, much like David in Psalm 51, after his sin with Bathsheba and having her husband killed, he describes that his sin is ever before him. He understood that God, would be his Redeemer and Savior, but he understood also what he had done, and that weighed on him. There was a certain, that young man who, defeated Goliath, was an older man after having done so many bad things, was weighed down by much of them. And that has on all of us. And so grief has been with us now for a lot of our group for a while. And it's been a little bit, I guess, of most congregations I've been in, it's probably been one of the harder periods. We even had a couple of people we almost lost back during COVID. And so those who are here remember them in the hospital. And we know how we felt when we thought they might pass on as well. And so there has been a great deal of, grief that has accumulated for the last few years. And I want to talk about this idea of the promise of rest. And in this passage, Jesus, I think, promises a rest. I think he does talk about it coming before we leave this earth, that we can already have some rest before we are done with our journey. But this journey is going to have its troubles. It's going to have its difficulties. He said even the night before he was taken away to his own disciples, in this world you're going to have trouble, but I leave you my peace. And so we can have peace. We can have the fruit of the Spirit, peace, joy, and love, and all of these things. But he knows as long as we're living in this flesh, on this world, we're going to have difficulties. Trouble will come our way. It will not be an easy road. There will be no, I'm going to get all my ducks in a row and then everything will be fine. It just doesn't work that way. That is an illusion that people often have. That somehow, well, I'm just going to, once I get this done, and once I get that, once I have this, job, once I have this house, once I have that family, once I have this, once I'm making this amount of money, that's just not the way life is. There is no getting everything situated and then it will all be great. No. You can get everything situated and have it be great, and it might not last very long before trouble comes. Because it can pretty easily go the other way. And it has for time immemorial. For many, many people who have thought everything was going wonderfully, and then all of a sudden something happened suddenly and things changed. We can be hit with something that is going to just rock our world, every one of us. But the great promise is that God says none of those things will prevent me giving you rest. Me taking care of you, your loved ones, and your friends. And we only have to lose these people temporarily. We don't have to lose them forever. As David himself said, upon his own infant's death, when he only lived for a short time, a handful of days, and he had been so distraught and praying that all of his servants were worried about him. They were worried to tell him when his son finally had passed away. How's he going to respond now? He's been so upset that he was sick. And instead of responding more negatively, he got up and cleaned himself up and got ready to move on with life. And he said, I'll have to go and meet him. It isn't a matter of, whether you're going to lose somebody. It's just a matter of when you'll lose somebody and who those people will be. But it isn't just those things. It can be things like dreams. When you're young, some of the very first griefs that you will suffer might be a loss of a dream that you had. You might dream of doing this or doing that, and that might be suddenly taken away, or maybe you all of a sudden realize, I don't have the skill or the ability for it. Or maybe I don't have the desire enough to endure what I have to for that dream. Because almost all dreams, visions, require some sacrifice on our part. And so we all endure grief, and we all endure grief from fairly young ages, all the way through life. And it won't really stop until the Lord has said it's finished. And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of the rest that remains. And in Hebrews chapter 4, the book of Hebrews kind of is describing a rest, especially in Jewish terms. It is a letter specifically written to Jewish Christians, many of whom were discouraged because their experience following the Messiah maybe wasn't as great as they envisioned. It wasn't the beautiful, glorious, wonderful walk with their Savior that they imagined. It was a difficult time. It was a turbulent and troubled life. And so the book really focuses on encouraging them to continue to walk the path with the Messiah. And so here in Hebrews, starting in verse 8, in Hebrews 4, he says, "For if Joshua had given them rest," and right before this, he was talking about how they didn't enter his rest. And many of them, and he's describing the rest of going into Israel, how God was taking them out of Egypt and taking them into Canaan, and he describes it as a land of milk and honey where they would have rest. But an entire generation that came out of Egypt couldn't enter his rest because of their unbelief. And so they waited an entire generation before their children entered. And so they didn't get to enter the rest. And so that's kind of the context of what he's describing here. If Joshua had given them rest, if Joshua was the one who led all of Israel into the promised land and they all had rest, then it would have been done. But it wasn't done. And it wasn't done on the Sabbath day. Because the Sabbath essentially means rest. The seventh day when they would rest, a day of rest, and they didn't work, and not work like you and I think about it. Most of us work 7 days a week because we do things like clean the house. We do things like, laundry, cooking. They weren't allowed to do those things on the seventh day. They had to rest, and everybody had to rest. No servants could work. Everybody rested. But that wasn't the rest either. And that's what he's talking about here. He says, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Obviously an allusion to Genesis chapter 1, describing all the work God did in creating the world and having rested on the seventh day. That very pattern is a pattern that the book of Hebrews is talking about here. And that seventh day pattern in Genesis 1 is a pattern that refers to our heavenly abode. And so he says, let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience that those who fell in the wilderness. For the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. So strive. We're going to, as long as we have life, we're going to be striving. We're going to be putting out effort. We're not going to be just at peace, at rest. We're going to be making an effort to press on, to keep going, even when it's difficult to keep going. But that's one of the reasons that was after COVID a couple of years ago, our theme for the year was about pressing on. Because it was difficult period of time. But you think, okay, after a difficult period, what do? We get ourselves up, we clean ourselves up, and we press on. We keep going, doing what we're able. And this is the character that is really being talked about in like Revelation 2 and 3 to all the 7 churches, when he talks about them being overcomers. That we have to have that resilience, that resilient nature to get up when we're knocked down, to not let difficulties stop us, to not let failure stop us, but to pick ourselves up and keep going. And we can do that not only just for ourselves, but we can help one another in that process as well. That's what this letter, the book of Hebrews, which is called a word of encouragement, by the way, which was a phrase used for giving a lesson. And this word of encouragement was encouraging people who were feeling like giving up and encouraging them not to, and reminding them of so many things in Jewish history and so many of their fathers, so many of their ancestors who had endured difficulties as well, but who pressed on to the glory that God speaks of. And so, Psalm chapter 90, we talked about it a little bit on Wednesday, talks about a life of toil and trouble. Let me switch over there really quick. And he says the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. We may live 70 or 80 years, he said. And during all of those 70 or 80 years, we are going to toil, meaning we're going to work. We're going to strive. We're going to have to put out effort. It won't come easy. And that's true whether people are in high positions or not, whether people have money or not. We sometimes think people with a lot of money don't suffer. It's just not true. Some things may be easier, but they also have some things harder. They sometimes struggle to know if people are really their friends or if they just like them for their money. It isn't simple. Life isn't simple no matter what you have or what you don't have. Life is full of toil, and your entire life you will toil to your abilities, right? We can't do more than we're able. So when we're really little, our chores are really tiny, and we may not even do them that well. But as we grow, our toil grows, and our ability grows, and we toil more and more. But also, as we get older, our abilities will begin to fade, and we will be able to toil less and less. This too is also the part of the span of life. And so he talks about not just the toil though, but also the trouble. We're all going to have troubles. Some of our own making. We will make mistakes that will bring trouble upon ourselves. But I don't know what percentage that will be. A lot of trouble will come your way, even if you never did anything wrong. How much trouble did Jesus have? And he didn't do anything wrong. And he didn't even spend a lot of years on this planet. Trouble will come our way, regardless of the situation, regardless of our talents, abilities, our goodness, or sinfulness. He says, but those 70 or 80 years, they are gone soon, and we fly away. We sing that song sometimes, I fly away. One day, we all will fly away. He says, who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? It's like, who's wondering, who's thinking about how powerful God is? Respecting him enough to honor his authority and his power. Too often people are like that generation that fell in the wilderness of Sinai after coming out of Egypt, even though they witnessed all of the miracles and signs that God did through Moses in Egypt, they still kept questioning him, doubting him, complaining to him, not thinking he could do things, even though he had demonstrated his power. That was their great downfall. They had seen it. They didn't just hear about it. They had witnessed it. And yet, they did not fear God. They did not honor Him or respect Him. And that's what Moses is talking about here, by the way. This is a prayer of Moses, written sometime during that 40-year span. And he says, so the conclusion, the lesson we should take from it, so teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Help us to remember we're not going to be doing this forever. Good or bad, whatever it is will pass. And this will be, and maybe a generation from now they won't remember it. Maybe a generation from now they'll remember you. But 2 generations from now, 3 generations from now, you and I aren't going to be remembered. Not by people that are still living, but God will know us. God will always care for us. And so he says, return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. So he has just told us we're going to have toil and trouble all of our days, and yet he is also saying we can be glad in all of them. We can rejoice in all of them. Not because work's not going to be hard, not because things won't be difficult, but because we know God's steadfast love for us. His faithful, merciful love. His covenant love for His offspring. We are His children. And He desires for all of us to be saved, He tells us. And so, being reminded, in fact, I almost thought about putting it in here, but I didn't put it in. But in Ephesians chapter 3, Paul describes praying for the people of the Ephesians that they would know and understand the love of God from a knowledge perspective. But then he says that they would also know and experience the love of God and the depth of it, the width and the breadth and the depth and the height of the love of God. Because we need to understand that. And not just mentally, but we need to feel it in our life. We need to understand the power, the impact He has made on our life. And that can allow us to rejoice in all of our days. Sounds an awful lot like what Paul talks about when he writes as a prisoner to rejoice always in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 4. But he says, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. So just like all those days that are difficult, make us rejoice and be glad in them. And he says, let your work be shown to your servants. Let your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us, yet establish the work of our hands. I didn't write that up there, Annette, but I think it's still good to end there. He says this, we made this point Wednesday in class, that he's asking for the favor of God to be bestowed on them, not so that they can not do anything and not have to do anything, but so that the work that they do will be established and good. That's what he's praying for. Not that we can have nothing to do, but that what we do will be good and godly and righteous in his eyes. And so turn over to Isaiah 52 if you're following along with me. Starting in verse 13, and I'm going to go through into chapter 53. He carried our griefs. And so just kind of to set up the passages that talk about him carrying our burdens and all of our griefs. Start in verse 13, because verse 13 down through verse 3 of chapter 53 is really a description of his servant that he would call. He says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up. He shall be exalted. As many were as many were astonished at you." His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. And he describes this person that nobody had paid any attention to, and all of a sudden, kings are bowing down to. Well, how many people do kings bow down to? Especially somebody of no report, of no significance in this world. And yet, how many people in human history can you say kings bow down to somebody born where he was born? This poor, young man born in kind of the outskirts of a tiny nation. Now, from God's perspective, Israel was critically important to everything. But from the world's view, from all the countries around Israel, they felt like a tiny little nothing. They rarely mention Israel all that much in their history. But Jesus, who comes from an area of it that Israelites called, well, can anything good come from Galilee? Being born or raised there up there. And yet he rises to the point that kings bow down to him. And that's what he's talking about that servant. But then he says in verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. So when he was despised and rejected and had all of these sorrows and griefs, as it said here, this is also quoted, by the way, this verse in the Gospels, dealing with the idea of our sicknesses and illnesses as well. And he said, because he healed them. And he quotes this verse as being a prophetic about that. But he says in verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The burdens of all of us were laid upon his shoulders. We sometimes think like we just have the weight of the world upon us. But none of us have ever had the weight of the world on us. But he did. Literally had the weight of every single person who had ever been born, who has ever lived in this world, was upon his shoulders. And he carried that to the cross. And he did it for us. Not, by the way, to take away the toil and trouble we would face in the flesh, but to deliver for us that promised rest that God promised those who would listen to him and follow him. And so he carried all of our griefs. You think about that idea about somebody walking in our footsteps, right? It's like, how can you really understand another person until you have walked in their footsteps, in their difficulties? And we sometimes struggle when other people, say they understand. Like, yeah, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But when people have gone through what we've gone through, okay, we get it. Right? Ann and I sometimes look at each other when I mention kidney stones. Ann and I know. I don't know how many others know, but Ann and I know. we get that little look if I mention it. And it's like, oh, yeah. We get it. We can explain it to people, but unless you had it, you're not going to explain it. Just like women trying to explain it to a man about trying to give birth, right? Maybe they can understand intellectually, but are they going to really get it? No. They're going to really get it. They can go through it. Now, would God really get it? All that we endured, being as weak as we are? Surely He does. But would we believe that? Would we think God really understands us? I think when you look at all of human history and people and their ideas about God being so distant and can't relate to us, that's actually what people generally think. Is that God, being so all-powerful and so all-knowledgeable, doesn't understand what it's like to be us. But then He came down and He lived with us. And we see Him live amongst us. And we see Him endure what we endure. And now we get it, that He understands. And He carries those things. He has carried those things for us. From the cross to His resurrection, to sit at the right hand of God on the mercy seat, sprinkling it with His own blood to make propitiation for our sins, to be our mediator. He did that for us, became one of us, walked like us, to lead us into that eternal glory, into that eternal rest. And so He was oppressed, and He was afflicted, yet He opened not His mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so He opened not His mouth. By oppression and judgment He was taken away, and as for His generation, who considered that He was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And He made His grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although He had done no violence and there was no deceit in His mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush Him. He has put Him to grief when His soul makes an offering for guilt. He shall see His offspring. He shall prolong His days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in His hand. Out of the anguish of His soul He shall see and be satisfied. By His knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and He shall bear their iniquities. And I'll stop there for now, but He took it all on Him to lead the way for us. Became one of us and said, follow me. Follow me to your glory, to your rest, to the peace that God has promised to all those who will listen. And so, just to kind of end off, I want to look at the first 4 verses of Revelation 21, because He will wipe away all our tears. No more grief, no more mourning. That's the thing, I describe so much of the kinds of grief we endure. And so much of it is fresh for many of us, for those whom we've lost. But there is promised a day where we won't grieve anymore. Because it isn't, when it comes to grief, it's not like you'll never grieve. It's like you don't just grieve for a little while. Whether it's a lost relationship, whether it's a lost, goal or hope. When you lose it, you don't get it back. And so there's a little part of you that always remembers that. And I can remember a movie that came back in the 80s after a dream I had for quite a while, kind of died right after college. And then a movie came out kind of about it. And it was just kind of a little reminder that stuck right in my side. I was like, oh, there was a movie about the very thing I dreamt of. And all of a sudden I couldn't, and I was a reminder I can't do it, right? I got a new phone recently. I'll give you another example of this. Got a new phone recently that, because I had cracked the screen on my Google phone, got a new Samsung phone. I was, changed it all over. And so some apps weren't working quite right. I couldn't get my voicemail to work. People were leaving messages. I couldn't listen. I could see it was there. It wouldn't download. It wouldn't read it. It couldn't see it. And it was like, I had to reset it and get it all. So after I reset it, and I had kind of said, okay, got to clear the cache, got to reset, got to reinstall the app, got to all reinstall. And every voicemail I've ever had was all of a sudden unread. And the very top line of a voicemail that I had that I needed to listen to was from Julie. I listened to it along with a few others, but it was a stab in the heart. It's kind of nice to hear her voice, but there was all that pain right back, right? Because that's what grief does to us. We carry it with us forever. We can press on and we can have joy and all of those things we can endure. But we also carry all the grief with us. But there is a day and a promise that we won't anymore. And that's what he's talking about here. And he says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. That's what he's leading us to. That's what he's promising us. Not that life's not going to be difficult, but that we could one day dwell with God and have all of this be remembered never again. Never having to grieve and never having to mourn. That's the promise. That's his rest. And so we're going to end there this morning. I appreciate your time. I hope it's a little bit of a comfort. Hopefully, I know how much grief is raw for so many of us. And this too, like so many troubles in life, it will pass. And it will be remembered no more one day. If you're in need of any help, if we can serve you in any way, please let us know how. Together we stand and sing.